like to welcome you to our Great Book series. For today, I'm Andrea Broomfield, Professor of English, who is the coordinator for this grand event. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the many people who make the Great Books mini-series possible, starting with Christy McWard and her staff here at the CoLab, as well as Susan McStadden for the photographs, Gay Hens for the promotional posters and signage, and Maureen Fitzpatrick for always helping with the marketing for our series. Today's speaker is Dr. Kathleen O'Neill, who attended graduate school at KU to receive her PhD in environmental science from the Department of Engineering, where she studied the scattering of light by very small particles. This work led her to a research and development position at Micromeritics Instrument Corporation in Georgia, and later to work with the Environmental Protection Agency. She had been bitten by the teaching bug when she was working as a TA in the math department at KU for her graduate school years. So when she returned to Kansas with her husband and a new baby, she found her chance when she responded to an advertisement in the Overland Park Sun newspaper. Remember when we had that? For an adjunct professor of math at JCCC. Luckily for us, she got the job and later became hired full-time. She's been at the college now for 27 years. Kathleen's current area of interest is incorporating art into the STEM disciplines of science, technology, engineering, and math. She recently gave a paper at a mathematics and art conference in Finland, and she has just returned from Pakistan, where she was an honored speaker on math education and women. It is with great honor that I introduce Kathleen O'Neill.
I have been part of the JCCC Book Talk group for years and years and years. And when Maureen Fitzpatrick asked me if there was a great book that I wanted to talk about, and maybe it could have something to do with math, I said, oh gosh, I don't know, let me think about it. 15 seconds later, I emailed her back and said, Flatland, I want to do Flatland. So I have known this book for years and years and years, and other people have too. I was delighted to learn that many people already know this book. Sheila Donetsky, my dean in science and healthcare, not healthcare, science and math and engineering, approached me and said, did you know that there are websites that talk about the 2D science? And I went, no. So, you know, like, how do you do an internal combustion engine in 2 dimensions? Terry Niemers is here with her class in typography. She teaches design graphics and typography, and she introduces Flatland to her class, where there are also videos made from Flatland and other books that have taken off from Flatland. So there's another person. And Bill Stockton stopped me in the hallway and said, I wish I could go, I can't. I want you to know that I know about Flatland because of reading Marshall McLuhan. And you may remember that Marshall McLuhan was the medium is the message. So sure enough, that really applies here. So that subtitle, A Romance of Many Dimensions. So when you think about this, if you came here expecting a love story, this is not going to be a bodice ripper. Another definition of romance is a medieval tale based on legend, chivalric love, and adventure. Stay tuned for Mickey McLeod's presentation on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It's coming. But this is our definition of romance. This is a narrative treating imaginary characters involved in events remote in time or place, and usually heroic, adventurous, or mysterious. And we've got all three here. So, one of the great advantages of a brick and mortar bookstore is that you can go in and you can browse. And last semester I was browsing Barnes & Noble, and I saw this on the new arrivals table. And I said, Literary Wonderland. So when I see that, I'm thinking of Wizard of Oz, Alice in Wonderland. And I opened it up and I said, if Flatland is in here, I'm buying this book. And so it came home with me. So Flatland by Edwin Abbott is on page 104. But a little further browsing, I found Slaughterhouse-Five, which was presented last semester by Dan Owens. And the Discover World series, and that's the next book. Night Watch is part of that series. So I think we have found our genre here. Edwin Abbott, he published Flatland in 1884 at age 46. He was a graduate of Balliol in Cambridge. He was a well-respected academician. He was a theologian, a grammarian, a Shakespearean scholar, and a poet. At the time that he published this book, he was the headmaster at the City of London School, which is a very well-respected private school of education. The setting for his life is the late Victorian era, and things were really starting to change at this time. It's true that many places did not have the right to vote for many men and most women. But it was also the time when Origin of Species by Darwin was published, and Lyell's, make sure I get the title of this right, Principles of Geology was published. And that established that biblical age of the earth may not have been the most accurate. And the church was not fighting these ideas. The church had kind of struck a truce between science and religion, and many people were getting involved in scientific exploration. So this was a very free-thinking time at the end of the Victorian era. So I start with a surrealist painting by René Magritte. This is not a pipe. Do you think it's a pipe? Well, it looks like a pipe, doesn't it? But it's not a pipe, it's a picture. Not only that, it's a picture of a picture. Okay, so this is really not a pipe. So I'm starting here because I'm going to show you some things that are not really what they are, and you're going to have to accept something. So here's the first thing. This is easy to accept. This is not a point. It is way too big to be a point. It has height and it has length. So I'm going to make it smaller. But this isn't a point either. It still has height and it still has length. And this isn't a point either. It still has height and it still has length. So a true point you can't see. A true point has no length or height. It has 0 dimension. But I have to show you a picture of this because that's the only way we're going to be able to get started to understand flatland. So I'm going to take that point, and which you have to just pretend is a real point, but I've given you enough of it that you can see it, and I'm going to duplicate that point, and I'm going to connect it. Now I have a line. Well, it's not really a line. A line should just have length, but this has length and height, because if I made it just a line, you wouldn't be able to see it. So you're going to have to take my word for it. This is a line. And now I'm going to duplicate that line. And I'm going to connect those points. Now, this is real. I have a square, and this really is in 2 dimensions. It has height and it has length. So now we're good. Now we can go to flatland. This is a square. This is the hero of our story. So Abbott divides this book up into 2 parts. The first part is about the cultural, the political, and the geographical aspects of flatland. And he says, imagine a vast sheet of paper on which straight lines, triangles, squares, pentagons, hexagons, and other figures, instead of remaining fixed in their places, move freely about, on or in the surface, but without the power of rising above or sinking below it, very much like shadows, only hard with luminous edges. And you will have a pretty correct notion of my country and countrymen. Alas, a few years ago, I should have said my universe, but now my mind has been opened to a higher view of things. So a square, and here is our square, can move around in this flat plane, but it can't go up. So it can go north or south, or west or east or west, there. But it can't go up. So it has to stay fixed in this plane, and that's what we have to become convinced of as we move along with this. Getting into Flatland, looking at A Squared's house is a good way to get started. So his house is a pentagon, a five-sided figure. And you can see that his cellar is not down, but his cellar is south. So you see the compass directions over there. And when it rains, the rain falls from the north to the south. So the pentagonal house sheds the water on that. As we go into the house, you can see different figures that are there. So we know that our square is our hero, but you can see that his sons are pentagons, and his grandsons are hexagons. So every generation increases its side by 1 unit. Now, as you increase, you get higher and higher, more and more sides, and those become the nobility. So pentagons and squares are the professional men, but when you become a hexagon or a septagon or an octagon and you start to move up, then you become part of the nobility, the aristocracy, until you get to the very highest rank, something that approaches being a circle. And the circle is the priest. They're the very highest nobility. Now notice there are some other figures over here that are not squares. They're less than squares. If you're a perfect equilateral triangle, then you are a tradesman. We don't have any tradesmen in this picture. We only have triangles that are less than equilateral, and Abbott calls these, A square describes these as isosceles triangles. So you see the very most narrow triangle that we have are the policeman and the scullion. They're the ones that do the grunt work in Flatland. The footman, he's a little bit broader, so he's moved up in the hierarchy. And then finally the butler is approaching being an equilateral triangle. So he waits on the gentry. So the other thing that we've got going here is the women. You'll see two women on here. One of them is his wife, who's in the middle of the hall. She's just a line. And the daughter, and she is just a line. So the women, here we go. The women are just lines. So one end of the women is a little bit brighter than the other, and the other end is very dull looking. Women and these very pointed triangles, they are capable of great mayhem because they can pierce things and kill them. And you have to be the policeman intentionally, but the women unintentionally, well, sometimes unintentionally, and Abbott, or the A square does talk about that, but men have to be very careful not to run into a woman or they'll get pierced. So women have to utter this peace cry where they have to kind of talk constantly in a murmur and say, I'm here, don't run into me, watch out. So notice it's the woman's responsibility to let the men know that there's danger about. Okay, the other thing that's really a problem is their back ends are not very bright. It's got a very dull load to it. It's very easy to run up against a woman. So the women are required to constantly move their rear ends so that the men can see them. This is very much of a double standard, as you can see. Now, if the figures keep adding a side with each generation, why doesn't everybody evolve to the point where everybody's in the nobility? And one of the laws of nature of flatland is that as you increase the number of sides, as you rise in society, fertility drops off. So you're always going to have plenty of triangles, creating more triangles and eventually rising, but you will also have the nobility producing fewer and fewer offspring as you go on. Perhaps this is also sociologically true in many cultures in Spaceland. Now, you're in space. How do you distinguish one figure from another? So, here's a square. Here's a square in space, and your eyes are on exactly the same level. And here's a circle. It's really important to get these right because this guy has a lot more social standing. But as you look at them straight on, can you tell the difference? So they look like lines. When you're in exactly the same level as the figures, they look like lines. How do you tell one figure from another? This is important because you don't want to accost somebody of higher rank. Well, you can feel them. Well, that sounds just about as icky as you would think to the people in Flatland. I don't really want to feel you, but there's a procedure for doing it. May I feel and will you feel me to see what we are? So as kind of an introduction. Well, this is very déclassé. So what you want to do is work on something called sight recognition. Well, sight recognition is hard. It depends on being able to look at an object and tell how do the sides fade away. So you can see that in the triangle, the sides are much further back, so you see a much sharper gradation in the shading as you look at them. But when you get to the pentagon, you see there's less gradation until finally you get to the circle and very little gradation. So very, very hard to learn this, and so you have to go to private schools to learn how to do it, which only the aristocracy can afford to send their children to. So, why do they make it so hard? Why not? Oh, in fact, who gets left out of this entirely are triangles and women. So, why not color code? So why not paint? Every shape gets a different color of paint. That would be easy, wouldn't it? And so even though you can't see the line, the line glows a little bit, you could get the color of it. Well, somebody tried this. And in fact, it was very popular, and it takes Abbott 3 chapters to explain what happened. So first he describes the ancient practice of painting, and it was highly admired. And then there was a rebel, Chromatistes, and he said, let's paint everybody. So this is where the color coding comes in. So Chromatistes, he was, not part of the aristocracy. He was a rebel leader. And through cunning and slick oratory, the aristocracy, the nobility, managed to turn the people against Chromatistes and his followers, and it became an act of sedition to propose color. Oh, and let me go back just for a minute. It became illegal to use color, and A. Square says the art of making color is now known to only one living person, the Chief Circle, for the time being, and by him it is handed down on his deathbed to none but his successor. One factory alone produces it, and lest the secret should be betrayed, the workmen are annually consumed. And fresh ones introduced. So great is the terror with which even now our aristocracy looks back to the far distant days of the agitation for the universal color. This is pretty thinly disguised as an anti-universal suffrage program here in Flatland, which can be directly related to the Victorians, I believe. And one last word from A Square as we leave Flatland. It's important to point out that Abbott himself was a great supporter of women's education, and he gives these words to A Square. One other word of warning suggests itself to me, though I cannot so easily mention a remedy, and this also refers to our relations with women. About 300 years ago, it was decreed by the chief circle that since women are deficient in reason, but abundant in emotion, they ought no longer to be treated as rational, nor receive any mental education. The consequence, lost my place here. The consequence was that they were no longer taught to read or even to master arithmetic enough to enable them to count the angles of their husband or children. And hence they sensibly declined during each generation in intellectual power. And this system of female non-education still continues. So, Flatland is not a perfect world. So, part 2, other worlds. And I have to confess, and I think I'm not alone in this, when I was remembering Flatland, I forgot all about part 1 and all of its sociology. This is the part that I remembered. So, this is where we enter thinking about point land and line land and space land. So A Square has a dream. So this is the night before the new millennium. So it's like New Year's Eve. And he's imagining what line land would look like. So you have to think about, so if you're in if you're in Flatland, all you can see are lines and points. If you are in line land, all you can see are points. So in the middle there is the king of line land, and he has 2 eyes. He's got eyes on both sides. And he sees a point over here and a point over here. And so what would be even smaller than a line to represent women? A point. So in line land, you have lines that are men, little lines that are boys, and points that are women. And he's thinking about how all of this works. And it's a pretty lengthy chapter in the book. It's worth reading. I'm not going to go into it because there's a lot going on in this particular section. But he tries to convince the king of line land that there's such a thing as flatland. The king is not buying it. And our hero, A Squared, he gets very upset with this, that he can't, take this dunderhead and say, look, there's another dimension out there. It's not working. So on not Christmas Eve, on the eve of the new millennium, our hero, A Square, and his wife are sitting in their hall, and they feel, or actually A Square feels a presence. And he is trying to figure out what this is when suddenly he sees a circle appear in the room out of nowhere. Well, this is a sphere from Spaceland entering Flatland. This sphere is allowed to go to Flatland, or a sphere is allowed to go to Flatland once every millennium to preach the gospel of 3 dimensions and get a convert. And he has chosen A Squared. And as the sphere rises through Flatland, the sphere gets smaller and even smaller until it vanishes. So all that our hero can see, A Squared, is these circles that keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller and then disappear. Maybe a better way for us to connect with that would be to look at a person falling through Flatland. So here's our hero. Here's A Square looking on in amazement. What does our square see? He sees 4 circles of different sizes, right? we see a human falling through there. This was published in a journal called Personal Construct Theory and Practice, which I think is just really appropriately named for this. Now the sphere is no more successful at convincing our square that there's another dimension as the square was capable of convincing the king of Lineland. So finally, in frustration, the sphere says, he just yanks him up into Spaceland. So here, finally, our square gets to rise above, and now he can turn around and look around. And what he sees amazes him. He is in Spaceland, and he is convinced, especially when the sphere introduces him to a cube. So remember, we took one object and another object and connected them to get the next dimension. So here I've got my square, and I've duplicated the square, and now I'm going to connect them. And now I've got a cube. So it's not really a cube. This is a two-dimensional representation, because it's still up here flat on the screen, right? Of a 3D object. Now it looks even more like a cube, doesn't it? So it's still a two-dimensional presentation of a 3D object, but this is a three-dimensional presentation of a 3D object. So we're just really good at inferring 2 dimensions from, or actually 3 dimensions from 2 dimensions, because we've gotten good at it. But if you've ever watched your dog watching television, they don't get it. That's just stuff on a flat screen up there as far as they're concerned. You have to be kind of trained to learn how to recognize that stuff. So the square says, this is wonderful, I'm a believer. And now tell me about the 4th dimension. And the sphere says, that's stupid. There's no 4th dimension. There is no such land. The very idea is utterly inconceivable. So with this, the square has to return to flatland. He arrives there just in time to hear a proclamation that enjoins the arrest, imprisonment, or execution of anyone who should pervert the minds of the people by delusions and by professing to have received revelations from another world. Well, this is terrible for a square because he's ready to proselytize. He is ready to preach the gospel of 3 dimensions. But he can't do it because he'll get arrested. Well, you can't keep a secret like that. So eventually it just gets the best of him, and he has to tell people, and he is in prison. So, a sad story. Now, I'm going to end with, because your very first question should be, what does a 4-dimensional object look like? So I'm going to end with Square's argument to the sphere about why the 4th dimension exists. So, as the sphere taught a square, was I not taught that as in a line, there are 2 bounding points? And there's our line. And in a square, there are 4 bounding lines. Sure enough, that's a square. And so in a cube, there must be 6 bounding squares. Sure enough, here's a cube, and I unfold that. So this is an unfolded 2-dimensional representation of our 3D cube. And does it not follow that the offspring of the divine cube in the land of 4 dimensions must have 8 bounding cubes, strictly according to analogy? So shouldn't I be able to take 8 of these and represent an unfolded what we call a four-dimensional cube. We call that a hypercube. And that's what this would look like. So I'm going to close with another surrealist painting by Salvador Dali. And you'll see, here we have the unfolded four-dimensional hypercube. And he's used that as a double view of the crucifixion. Now, to show you other representations of what hypercubes look like in 3 space, I'd ask Brenda Edmonds, who's teaching Calculus 3 this semester, to have her students show us other representations of that.
You guys want to show some of your, they built some and brought them today, so we have some over here.
Do you want to bring them up to the front, or would it be easier to go back over here?
You don't have to if you want to. Want me to?
Oh yeah, you guys should do
You guys
this.
should do it. So some of them are the same and some are different. Who made this one? I don't remember.
Here, let's go. We'll bring it up here.
Michael.
Who's Michael?
Michael, he's right in front.
Michael. Tell us about this.
Well,
You have to go the whole way.
okay. So this one model I made off of the idea, we've got our single line, our point, and we drag it out to be a line. And then we drag the line up to be a square. And then we drag the square back to be a cube and a 90-degree angle to the previous angles. And then we can't drag in another 90-degree angle that's perpendicular to all the other angles, so it's a perspective type view, and I drag the cube back.
Oh, this.
These were from, some of these, so these ones in the box are the ones that people brought today.
Okay.
Anybody else want to talk about
Which one do you have?
The other Connects one, yeah.
Okay, well go ahead and show that. It's made with Connects. I love Connects.
Yeah.
Ask my students.
So if I can do the same thing.
You still got it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the duplicated cube is kind of inside on that one, they intersect on that one. Who made this one? Logan. Logan's is a little different.
Oh yes.
So you have a cube, and then I sort of made a bigger cube, and then connected all the components to the cube inside each other. But the cubes can sort of go inside of each other and back out of each other.
Yeah. So you want to talk about the thing you guys looked at on the computer too? That showed that? Did you look at that on the? Yeah.
So I guess it'd be better with this one. So I guess if you were to sort of rotate this around, then it's sort of go into the lines would sort of phase through each other, and the sides would phase through each other, and the cubes would sort of rotate into each other and around each other. That's hard to say.
Well, actually, sharing that difficulty is part of the problem.
We got a couple other ones Aaron's made us.
So kind of one way that made sense to me about it is when you look at a normal cube, certain views of it are more descriptive than others. So if you look at it like, face on, you just see a square. But if you turn it a little bit, that cube, you can kind of see two obtuse angles on it. So you can see, all right, that has a little bit more perspective. And then if you tilt it a little bit more, then you'll see a little bit more. So when you're looking at a four-dimensional object, it kind of depends on your perspective of where you're looking at it, and that perspective is going to kind of change the object, because each of these cubes are actually connected by a face, by a square face on all sides. If that kind of makes sense.
Yeah. And then this one, Diana's in the back. She said she didn't want to talk. She made this one, which is kind of cool because you actually can see the 8 cubes on this. So she put clear plastic over the side. So there's a cube inside and outside. So you can actually see the 8 cubes that are there. And then the other ones don't really look like cubes because they're not at right angles, but there's one kind of on each face of this cube. There's one from here to the cube inside, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then the great big one on the outside and the little one on the inside. So you can see the 8 cubes that unfold to get that one. We got another little tiny one. see how she's sitting there in the back. Yeah, that's me also. This was one from a different semester, kind of just a different rotation. I just brought a couple different ones in case.
Is this from another semester?
Yeah, that's from
too?
another semester too.
I wanted to grab this one because this is exactly what this figure is right here. So this is a three-dimensional representation of a four-dimensional object that has been unfolded. So this is the unfolded object, which is hard to recreate. So,
Yeah, so these are all kind of just different representations of the same thing.
thank you very much. This has just been a delight.
All right.
Oh,
Have anything that you'd like to add or ask?
it's a very short book. You know, it's only about 80 pages long. And if you're going to read one version, I really recommend the version that's annotated by Ian Stewart. He's gone into the history of everything in there. It's available in paperback from Amazon, so it's not expensive.
Although the original is now public domain. It's been around long enough that you can find it free on Google Books.
Yeah.
So not the annotated one. It's very nice.
The original.
But the original one is it's in the public domain.
In fact,
So you
Pat
can find
brought a
it.
copy of it with her, so.
This is almost an original.
And I have lots and lots of editions of this book because every time a new edition comes out, a new mathematician writes a new introduction. And so I've been collecting them for the different introductions because that's what math people do. Yes, ma'am?
Where did you get your visuals? Are those from the original?
I should have said that. So the
I
ones.
saw it dated, but I just haven't seen them.
Right. The book itself, all of those things that looked like they were drawn with pen and ink, those were drawn by Abbott. And I should have said that. It was in my notes and I used it. So the others,
Really helped.
the others I got online, and where attribution was required, I gave them attribution. Yeah, so. Yes. Oh, hi Jane.
So, as I remember, A square ends up in a bad place,
A prison.
right? So what's your take on what that means at the end of the day, that this prophet of the space world ends up in prison for 7 years?
I took this to be, my personal interpretation was this is Galileo all over again. So. All right, well, I'm going to go teach class. Anybody want to come learn college algebra? You can come with me.